keep you too long here. Probably, probably looking at maybe an hour and a half, to get through this presentation. So feel free. I got the chat box open here. So if you have any questions as we're kind of going through the PowerPoint, just let me know. Hopefully I catch them. I'm not terribly familiar with Zoom, so I think there's like a raise your hand function button too that I might be able to see. So we'll just kind of play it by ear at this point and see how everything goes for that. So thank you all for being here. We're going to talk about writing prescribed burn plans this evening. So this is kind of one of these topics that historically, when we talk about prescribed burn writing, it's one of these things that is so varies across the board from state to state, from local fire districts to different agencies and stuff like that. So I'm going to be kind of very broad and general with some of my remarks and some like how to plan a burn and put together a burn plan. We're going to kind of discuss different types of burn plans, how to make maps, and all these different things. So hopefully you'll, by the end of this, hopefully you'll understand the kind of the role and the needs of a prescribed burn plan. Learn about the steps in creating a burn plan, how to make maps, and then we'll go through some examples and then end on some common mistakes that I generally see in evaluating and also writing burn plans. So I guess I probably should introduce myself. I forgot to do that. So my name is Brian Teeter. I'm the Nebraska Prescribed Fire Coordinator with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. I've been on the job since 2015, so almost coming up on 5 years here, almost 6 years in this position. And I've been with the organization for about 10 and a half years now, starting here, whole career with Pheasants Forever here in Nebraska for about 10 years. So when we talk about what is a prescribed burn plan, it's documentation of the who, what, when, where, and why, and the how we are going to complete a prescribed burn. It's very important that you document it. I know there are some states that don't require prescribed burn plans, but they're always a very good thing to have. Kind of forces you to think through that process. And typically we write these on a template of some sorts. And so we'll go over some of these templates later, but there's templates that range from, it could be 4 pages of written stuff to I've seen federal agencies got these binders of, 50 plus pages that they have to go through just to do one prescribed burn. So hopefully we're not going to, go there, right? I don't think most prescribed burns that we're doing within the Great Plains aren't going to require a 50-page burn plan. So most of them, obviously can be very basic. We'll talk about really simple meat, potatoes, basic plan, and then we'll get into a little bit more of a complex burn plan where more things are happening. So these templates are basically on how to burn, which it really forces us to think about the many factors before we actually put fire on the ground, right? So the fact that, fire can be dangerous, we want to make sure that we have our I's dotted and our T's crossed before we actually put fire on the ground. So it really forces us to think about, what kind of hazards are on the landscape, what are our objectives, what kind of type of equipment do we need, what kind of contingency plans do we also have on the landscape if something does go wrong. It also acts as a record for future burns or land managers. So, in 10, 20, 30 years down the road, they can look back and say, oh, they did a burn at this time. And, here's all the different things that they needed and, the years that they did them. So it actually has a really good record. It's also required by some state statutes. For example, here in Nebraska, which I'll cover. I know there's quite a few people that aren't in Nebraska on here, but I'm going to talk a little bit about our state statute for those that are in Nebraska. Many agencies require them. So if you're working for a federal, state, nonprofit, they require burn plans. And then, of course, local fire departments, if you have to get a burn permit, sometimes you'll need a burn plan for that as well. Now, the best part about putting together a good burn plan is a burn plan shows that you're acting with care caution, and intent, right? So the reason why, if you think about, sorry, I gotta turn off my fire pager. Sorry about that. So one of the things that if you have a burn and it gets out, right, most likely you're going to get sued. And so if you do get sued, you can go back and look at this burn plan and say, well, we took all these precautions prior to burning, right? That's not going to totally absolve you from any kind of liability, but it's certainly going to show that, that you did it without, malice, or, that you're being willfully negligent, right? So I always recommend holding on to that burn plan for at least 1 year if you do a burn. And that's primarily because, if somebody does sue you, it could be through like smoke, right? So, somebody could, plan to sue you and have a, smoke claim against you. So hold on to that burn plan for at least a year. We typically, when I write burn plans, I typically store them digitally. And so I've got them, forever. I got them stored on the cloud. And then really the real reason we're needing these burn plans is about safety, right? So the fact that we're putting together burn plans to make sure that everybody involved goes home safely and everything goes off without a hitch. So one thing that I have learned about writing burn plans, that there is 1,001 ways to write a burn plan. Each person that I know that writes burn plans develops their kind of own individual style based on several things. One, how they were taught, how their people that approve their burn plans or review their burn plans like it, or kind of a local need, right? So one of the things I recommend is if you're required to write a burn plan to get a burn permit like you do in Nebraska, the first thing I recommend is contacting your local fire chief and asking them what they would like to see in a prescribed burn plan, because there's no worse feeling than writing a burn plan and taking it to the fire chief and then they want a bunch of extra stuff put in there. So it's always best to just ask them first, and so you have that knowledge going into it right away. So one of the things also is you can include as much information in a burn plan as you want. And that's why some of these like federal agencies, they've got 50, 100, pages of burn planning stuff going on, and most of it nobody ever looks at. So I always caution against overdoing something that can be simple, right? If you can get away with writing a 4-page burn plan, write a 4-page burn plan. If your agency or department or something requires something larger than that, that's fine, but don't overdo something that you don't need to. Also, with a prescribed burn plan, many times the language can be copied and pasted with just additional local details added. So many templates that we use, we kind of have some language in there where we can just copy and paste it, which makes it really easy because then you just, you can crank them out. So writing burn plans takes practice, and the best way to do it is just to start doing it and writing them and getting reviews from them. So the more you practice on writing burn plans, the better that you'll become at them, especially, if you're making maps and putting together that stuff. It just takes time. So starting with a simple burn plan and working up towards complex burns. So if you're just starting out writing a burn plan, you may want to just start with your, CRP, local, nice, easy square, and work up to stuff that's kind of more complex, just to kind of build your confidence as you go. So when you get into kind of these really complex burns, sometimes it's easy to get frustrated with it just because there's a lot going on. You end up rewriting it 3 or 4 times because things change as you kind of go along. Ask for help for reviewing them from experienced burners. So a lot of times, it's kind of like you stare at your own project for so long, sometimes you miss like the easiest things in the world. And so it's really easy for you to ship that off to somebody and say, hey, how's this look? And people provide, constructive criticism and stuff like that. So practice. You learn by doing. And the other big thing is when you're writing a burn plan, it's really beneficial to have knowledge of actually being on burns. So if you've never been on a prescribed burn, you're trying to write a burn plan, it can be very frustrating. And I understand that because I work with a lot of landowners that we try to get them to write their own burn plans, and it's frustrating because they maybe never been on a burn or ever seen a burn plan. So for those of you in Nebraska, just a little history in our state. So prescribed fire in Nebraska is regulated by our state legislature, and there are several statutes that basically apply to that. So there's a statewide open burning ban on all bonfires, rubbish fires, and fires for the purpose of clearing land. So it essentially means that we can't go out and just start a fire. Now, I'm originally from Iowa, and in Iowa, you could just go out and start a fire basically whenever you wanted without a burn plan, without calling anybody. It was amazing. Things are a little bit different here. So the fire chief of a local fire department may waive an open burning ban in their jurisdiction, which is a really good thing, right? So our state can't come in and say, we're shutting down fire. I guess, well, technically they probably could, if the governor mandated or something like that. But the local fire department, it has the local jurisdiction to issue burn permits, which can be good and bad thing at times, right? So a written burn permit from your local fire chief is required by law. It has to be on paper or in writing. You must notify the fire chief prior to starting the burn. We also notify dispatch as courtesy before starting the burn. And if you don't do this, you will be in violation and could be subject to a class 4 misdemeanor of $100 to $500. So a permit for land management burning can be issued only if land management burning is conducted in accordance to 81.5.2005. Basically, you must submit an application for a permit, and the burn plan contents of the burn plan are outlined in it. Now, when they came up with the burn statute, they made it really simple. Like the stuff that we have to put in our burn plan to be compliant with our state statutes, like really simple, really easy, which is good. But the fire chief will evaluate that plan and determine its compliance. And if it complies with state statute, then they shall issue a burn permit. And that burn permit shall be valid for no more than 30 days. Now, what needs to be in this burn plan? The name of the landowner, the name of the person who's going to supervise the burn, if it's different than the landowner, the objective that's going to be accomplished. You also need a map showing the areas to be burned, including natural and man-made fire breaks. So technically all you need on the map is to outline the burn unit and put in your fire breaks. That would comply with state statute. So if you're worried about creating maps, and I'll show you maps that are basic, and then we go a little bit above and beyond. But that's really all you technically need. And then the procedures used to confine the fire in the boundary without pre-existing fire breaks. So how are you going to stop that fire? Are you going to, use a disc fire break? Are you going to use a wet line? How are you going to confine that fire within that boundary? And then you also need a list of equipment that will be on hand. And then to round it off, the types and conditions of vegetative matter to be on the land and in adjacent areas. So not only do you need to say what you're burning, but also what's surrounding you. And so that's for the benefit of the fire chief and the fire department. So essentially, if something happens, they know, if you're burning with a south wind, they know what the vegetation and what stuff is to the north in case it does get out. And then basically the identification of roads and homes that may be affected by smoke. And then lastly, a description of weather conditions believed to be required to safely conduct the management activity. Basically, wind speed, direction, temperature, and humidity. Very, very simple. Those are like the big three things that we look at anyway when we're writing the prescription. That's what we call prescribed burning. And then because this is government, this is how government works, they put this clause in there: such other information as may be prescribed by the fire chief or local fire department. And this could literally mean anything. So, and this is why I recommend that you reach out to the local fire department and fire chief to figure out if there's any specific things that they want in that plan or need, you know. So again, a statutorily minimum burn plan is really simple, and almost any landowner can produce one. I've seen them on blank pieces of paper, written within like 20 minutes inside of a FSA office. You know, pretty easy to do. Like I said, we typically go above and beyond what is statutorily the minimum, just because we want to have that extra information, you know, for our burns. And having the templates that we use makes it really easy to just plug in that information. Okay. So all you non-Nebraska folks can come back now. So when I go out and start planning a prescribed burn, there's a few steps that kind of a step process that I like to follow. And that basically starts with, you know, pre-scouting, and then moves to the site visit, inventory, writing the plan, review the plan, and then kind of the final review and site confirmation. So we'll kind of go through each of these steps and talk a little bit about what I look for and what I'm looking at when I'm planning a prescribed burn. So the first thing I do is I'm sitting in my office. I pull up an aerial photo of where I'm going to burn, right? I use Google Maps, right? I get in there and I'll take a look at it, not only the site, but kind of the surrounding areas. And so makes it really easy. I can kind of look at broad scale vegetation, all this stuff. The other thing that I really like to pull up, I'll pull up Google Maps. I'll kind of look around, make some mental notes, and I'll print out copies of the map. The other thing that I really like using is LiDAR or hill shade. So some of you resource professionals know what I'm saying, but LiDAR is essentially, it's ground penetrating radar. It basically kind of really shows the lay of the land really well, better than like a topo map would. I've got some examples of it here coming up, I'll show you, but and why it makes such a huge difference. But pulling up just regular aerial photos and LiDAR, both of those, definitely want to pull those up. And make sure you include the area adjacent to the planned burn unit, simply for the fact that not only is it good to, you know, in case we have an escape or something like that, but, you know, if you go look back at our statute, we got to make sure that we include what the vegetation is, and all that stuff. So I'm printing out several copies of these because my next step is going to be going out in the field with these. But the first thing I'll do is I'll begin by drawing out what my desired burn boundary looks like. So, you know, if it's like your field, you know, maybe just draw your property line, right? That's your desired boundary. Like, this is what I want to burn, right? Not saying that that's what it's going to end up being like, you know, and we'll talk about that, but just where you're looking at. And start documenting the known things you know about this burn unit and adjacent areas, right? We can take a look at broad scale vegetation on-site and off-site. Is it all grassland? Is it rangeland? Do we have a lot of cedar trees? Are there hardwood trees? Do we have wetlands on site? You know, basic things that you can determine from aerial photography while sitting behind a desk, right? Jot those things down, put them on the map, scribble notes. You can also look at, you know, buildings, right? Are there any farm or old farmsteads? Are there houses? Look around outside of the unit. You know, try to look at all the different houses surrounding the site, because that can make a big difference in how we're planning the burn or picking our wind direction. If we have a bunch of houses to the northeast of our burn unit, maybe a southwest wind's not going to work for us. So as we're planning that burn, we're going to be looking at those things to avoid, right? We're going to maybe look at it from a different perspective, saying maybe we want to burn it with a northwest wind or a west wind or something like that. You can also easily
Yeah.
map any kind of roads and trails that you see on
This is
there.
Dwayne Knott.
Again, you're going to want to know all this stuff later on.
This is Dwayne Knott. You just
Take a
called
look
me.
at the known history of the site. You know, if you're familiar with it, does it have currently, is
I
it
mean,
being
my phone
grazed?
rang
Has
and
it
I
been
said
burned?
hello, and it was you.
Maybe it's a project that you have been working on, you know, for quite a while, so you know this history.
Who am I speaking with? Gary Fleming. Okay, were you wanting to call
Gather up the
me?
details about that site ownership. You know, this may be you, so this may be very easy,
Oh,
but
oh, that's
jot
okay.
down a landowner name,
I
what
hope you're
the
okay.
what the contact information is,
Oh boy. Well,
county, section, township range.
well, good luck with it, sir. All right. That's okay. Not to worry. Not to worry. Okay. Bye-bye.
Sorry. And then define your objectives. Like, what is your primary reason for burning? And this could be, you know, lots of different things, right? You could have fuel reduction, control of eastern red cedar. You could improve forage. Maybe you're just doing it for ecosystem maintenance. You know, I've seen people just, you know, their objective is to comply with CRP regulations. I mean, that's, I guess, an objective. It's not a great one, but it is an objective of one. And it can also be multiple things. You can have, you know, absolutely multiple things to do with a burn. And we'll talk a little bit about creating those objectives later on. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to, after I've gathered kind of all that information in the office, I've kind of got my head wrapped around what, you know, what the site kind of looks like from a 10,000-foot level. Got some basic information on the way. I like to plan a site visit, and I like most of the burns that I'm planning. You know, it's going to take me an entire day, especially for more complex burning. There's a lot of burns that I can actually plan without ever going into the field, but I've also been writing burn plans for 13 years. So plan to spend some time in the field. If you're working with a landowner, make sure you plan time to spend some time alone as well. And and I do this because, and I'll talk a little more about, but a lot of times you get they have landowners have an already implicit bias of their own property, and sometimes that can get away with, in, you know, maybe your professional judgment. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Make sure you bring plenty of copies of the maps, clipboards, pens, what have you. So the first thing I'm doing when I go on a site visit, the first thing I'm going to do if working with a landowner is I'm going to have them basically drive me around that proposed burn unit, because they're gonna basically give you kind of the tour, right? And you'll be able to kind of ask questions and jot down, you know, answers like as you're driving along. You know, looking at certain things like, oh, where's that trail lead to, or, you know, is there, you know, a lot of badger holes out here, and oh, don't go down there, you know, or there's a big dump over there. So there's a lot of things that you can learn from the landowner by just driving around. And I recommend that if you can, it's really easy when you go out on a site visit to have a landowner jump on a side by side and you guys go look at it. But most of our prescribed burns that we do here in Nebraska require trucks to get around our boundaries. And so I always recommend driving around in a truck to get around, because if you can't get around in a truck, then it's going to be harder to burn. And then you can always follow it up with the UTV ride and stuff like that. So some of the questions that I ask are, you know, what are the hard to reach areas? What are the trouble spots? Are there any wet areas? Are there any natural springs that, you know, pop up out of nowhere that make things difficult? Some questions like, you know, does the road to access to the site, you know, how many days after rain does it take for it to dry out for people to reach the site? I've had instances where, you know, we plan this big burn and, you know, it rains maybe 2 days before, but it's a minimum maintenance road, and it takes at least like 4 or 5 days for it to dry out before you can usually get to where maybe we do our staging area. Also, the another really big thing is Ask them what their relationship with your neighboring landowners, neighbor property owners are. This is one of the biggest things that you can run into. If they've got really good relationships with their neighbors, it makes planning fire so much easier. But if you know, like, the guy that lives on the east side of the property is a troublemaker, and they don't get along, right? They argue about everything, and fix a fence and all that stuff. Then you know that maybe you want to just avoid that in the future. One of the other big things that we run into, especially when planning a prescribed burn with maybe a landowner that we're not necessarily familiar with, is what type of equipment they have access to. So do they got a tractor or a skid steer? Do they have any kind of fire equipment like pumpers or drip torches? Right. So, if a landowner says, I got a dozer, you're like, that's amazing, right? Like, or a skid steer, because they can use a skid steer to cut, maybe have a tree shear with it so they can cut trees. Or they got a tractor that they could hook up a disc to if needed. All those things are going to be needed kind of going down in the future. So, writing that information down, right, ahead of time as you're kind of going around the property is good to know. And also, what about access to water? Where are the hydrants? Where's the good clean water that you can pull from, right? Typically, we don't want to fill from a hydrant, the typical frost freeze hydrant, just because it takes so long to fill pumpers, but they're always good in case you want to just stick a hose in it on a tinder while you're burning and having to refill. Where are the stock tanks at, right? So sometimes we refill from stock tanks. Again, they can be kind of dirty, so we got to be careful with that. Do they have any water tenders, right? Most farmers or ranchers got water tenders, for cattle or for fertilizer, stuff like that. So where's that access to the water? And then also know any kind of like known hazards, right? Do they know if they have a pipeline running through the property? What about the power poles? Deer stands. Deer stands are big, right? We see some pretty elaborate deer stands that need protection in the middle of burn units all the time that need to be, weed eated around or burned out prior to it. In every farm I've ever visited, there's always that one hole. I don't know what it is. There's always one big hole that you can easily fall into or drop a truck in. In my case, on my farm here, I got this. It's not. I wouldn't consider it a hole. I would consider it a cavern. That if you were going around the corner and your back tire slipped into it, it would probably be a 20-foot fall down into it. So, things like that, where we could potentially go out and stick a flag in the ground to, throw a big caution in the wind, something like that. Another good question to ask landowners is how they feel about their fences. And this is just kind of preempting the question about when we're burning. We're typically going to be burning through fences. And sometimes fences, the posts are old and they catch on fire. If they're completely adamant about, don't want to fix fence posts or they don't care about the fence, just gauge their interest on doing that, and then also just look at the fence in general, right? If they just bought the property and they put in new creosote posts, it's, you want to smack yourself in the head if they did that, but those things are all going to kind of matter, moving forward when you're actually trying to plan that burn. And then anything that would really severely impact the site in the near future, right? So if there's a big drought coming up this year, do they have a drought mitigation plan that basically includes the site that you're planning to burn to be used, right? So is a drought this year going to throw off a fire in the future, or are you going to have less vegetation out there than you were planning? Or is it going to be potentially stuff hayed around you that wasn't planning on burning or haying prior? Ask them if they're going to be cutting any trees. One of the most frustrating things that I run into is that you plan a burn with the way the site is currently situated, and then they go out and start cutting trees and putting brush piles all over the place. So ask them prior to doing that, if they're going to be doing any of that, because then you can mitigate that up front. Like, okay, well, if you're going to be cutting trees, let's properly place these piles in a certain spot that's going to, be better for our burn. right? And more likely, that they're going to cut them and burn them prior to the burn. And then also, if they're planning on deferring grazing, that's going to make a huge difference in the future if you're planning burns on like rangeland. And I'm sure there's probably a million more questions that you can ask, but as you start planning these burns, are going to come up with kind of your own kind of list of questions and things that you're thinking about that seem to happen, and it can be very more local, right? So I'm very Nebraska centric when I talk about some of these things, but some of you out of staters could have very different things to be talking about. And then once I'm kind of done going around with the landowner and they kind of give me the lay of the land, I like to go out and actually do an inventory without the landowner, and like pretty much by myself. And I do this because I want to view that properly, objectively from my point as a burn boss, without their bias, and even without somebody else's bias too, right? If you got somebody that's with you helping plan it, I still like doing it alone because I like getting that kind of objective. Like, okay, if I was burning this property, how would I do it? Versus how are they going to want to burn it? Two different things. And then, of course, depending on that site complexity, I like to use the ATV, UTV to get around. Again, after we've already kind of used a truck to get around those spots. So you're able to kind of go in and out of areas really easily, get off and inspect things, carry your gear and all that stuff. So this is my chance to do a really thorough look at the burn unit, to do kind of a detailed analysis and inventory everything. So the first thing that I do is walk the boundary. When you walk the boundary of the burn, I can almost immediately determine whether it's a good boundary or maybe we need to adjust it. So this happens all the time on burns because most of the time people think kind of narrowly when they say, oh, I want to burn that pasture. They're thinking of that specific 160 acres. Like, that's what I want to burn. But that 160 acres may not be, the best. You may actually burn 140 acres, or we might make it bigger. If we can include more land around it, one, we're getting more fire on the ground, which is a bonus. But also, a lot of times, making that land larger also makes the burn safer in the future. So more acreage burned and safer. That two things right there are a big win in my book. So even if you're a landowner, just burning off your CRP, think outside the box and maybe, approach your neighbors like, hey, maybe they're not ever thought about burning, but, include them on the burn. I could tell you from experience that, sometimes burning 100 acres is the same as burning 1,200 acres, right? It takes the same amount of effort and energy and not necessarily time, but to plan it and conduct the burn. And sometimes it's even the same time, like, get a good back burn in downwind, you can easily ring the thing pretty well. So once any boundary changes is looked at, you can proceed with an inventory. Now I got a picture here of an example of where we looked at the boundary and after we walked it. So this is a burn that we planned a couple of years ago. This is, I think, a 330 acre range burn that we did. You can see that this west side here was the boundary. And this was an EQIP application done through the NRCS office where they were going to specifically burn this piece. Well, right when you look at it, what's the first thing that sticks out to you, right? You look at that northwest corner and you got this big grove of trees on, basically splitting them right down the middle. Well, if you burned a lot, that looks like a potential problem, right? Well, remember when I talked about how I like pulling up LiDAR, that hillshade? Before I ever stepped foot on this ground, I knew exactly that this boundary was going to be terrible. And I'll show you why. So here's the hillshade. So right here is that boundary and you can see the fence line right there that they originally wanted. Well, before we even got out there, we had two options. We could potentially try to put a fire break down this fence line, but it would take a lot of work, might require a bulldozer. So basically we had two options at that point. We could either, the landowner could either spend a bunch of time going in and burning that, or we potentially would have to move that fire break on top of this ridge here to make it, to make it easier. But the good news is one, he owns all this too. And so all we had to do, there was a gate right here, and there was already a trail that went all the way back to the back of this property. And so instead of having to do any dirt work, the only thing we had to do on this burn is we had to go in and cut like 50 or 75 foot of trees up in this corner. So right there, we just simplified the burn and made this so much safer just through the use of, knowledge of the site. And this LiDAR is absolutely amazing. And that's why I always pull it up. All of our employees, I think, have access to it. I believe, I don't know where you can get it. I think you might have to go into the USDA office, to your NRCS office, and they could probably print you out a copy of the LiDAR if it's in your area. I'm not sure it's on, that the LiDAR coverage is across the entire country yet. I think they're working on it. So again, we're talking about a detailed inventory of the site. Basically include all those things that can cause an issue on a burn or what your crew may need to know. And jotting down these notes on their locations, what needs to be accomplished in order to mitigate or fix it, right? This could be like, okay, here's a stock tank that we maybe need to weed eat around, the pump, a solar pump, or the house may need some pre-burning before we do it. Take pictures and take them back to the office with you. So when you're going through your burn plan, you can very easily just reference back to what it looked like in case you kind of forgot of what maybe needed to be done. Or if you need to get a second pair of eyes on it to say, hey, what would you do about this area? And this could also go for just like, vegetation wise, like you're on a part of a burn boundary that looks a little sketchy, like take a picture of it and send it to somebody and say, hey, what would you do in this situation? So basically what I would do is I would do a detailed inventory of vegetation on the boundary, about 300 foot on either side of it. What type of vegetation is it? What is it? What's the condition of it? I'm looking for snags. If you're burning in timber, look for snags along that line. If there's a bunch of snags along that line, maybe we want to reroute that burn line. Maybe there's a bunch of brush piles that are in an area. Document all those because brush piles are the worst. Where are the vehicle access issues? Are there areas where we can't get a truck? Is there areas that maybe we need to get a UTV in there? Or maybe there's places where we have to do handwork. We're doing a burn this spring where there's like this, 40-foot section. Instead of going like a quarter mile around this tree grove, we're just going to put a hand line in this thing in this ditch and basically save ourselves an hour and a half worth of work. Are there any areas that need any dirt work to make it or improve access? Sometimes, in areas you could just go in and make your own access or improve that. Where are those wet or steep areas or washouts? Good thing to ask that landowner too, is there any areas that wash out after a heavy rain? And then mark all the gates and access points that you have. If they're pre-existing, already there, that's great. Sometimes in some burns, we got to create our own access points. So document those if you think that, maybe an area that, a section of fence that's bad anyway, maybe it'd be a good place to have another access point. And then any utility poles, gas or oil infrastructure. So one of the things I learned about this is all this stuff is marked and they've got numbers on them. So they're very easy to just jot down the numbers, the name and numbers of the companies that have the pipelines or utilities. And that way you can include that in your burn plan as well as, contact them prior to see if they have any conditions that they need. Some utility companies just basically want you to kind of take a shovel and stir up some dirt around them or weed whack around them, stuff of that nature. And then, of course, any hunting blinds that are out there. I've got some, I don't have them in here, but I got some doozy pictures of hunting blinds. My favorite is a late 1960s RV that was on the fence line, and it wasn't even camouflaged. It was green and white, and on the side of it said "Deer stand, don't shoot." I'm like, okay. Another big thing is where the hay bales at, right? So here at my farm, my neighbor puts hay bales on the fence line every single year, and it's always it always depends on how bad of a winter that we have, whether they're gone by the time we're burning or not. So identifying where those hay bales are at, and potentially if you're, burning, not burning for another year or a couple years, maybe you could work with that landowner to have them put the hay bales in a different spot, just to make it easier on yourself. Drive all the different roads and two tracks and trails, just to get an idea that if you need to use them, what kind of are they, can you get access them by ATV or UTV? Are they foot only? All that stuff. Make sure you get all your ponds, creeks identified. And this one is important too. Always be on the lookout for identifiable landmarks for drop points. And we'll talk about drop points in a while, but these can basically be abrupt turns, gates, wolf trees. These are trees that, are like really big and mature compared to like the rest of the area. Certain landmarks like that, tops of ridges, things like that, where you can put these drop points on there. And then, of course, any homes, outbuildings. Again, taking pictures of those for future reference on preparation is always good. Also, we're potential sites for staging. So typically, when we do a prescribed burn, we all show up. Everybody drives. We've got depending on the size of the burn, you got 10 trucks, 20 trucks. So there's always a need to place for staging of where everybody's going to fill up their trucks with water, or get their equipment hooked up, or unload their UTVs, ATVs. So always be looking for sites like that. Typically, that's we always want to do it on the upwind side of where our smoke is potentially going to be going, because you don't want to smoke out your staging area. And then almost every farm has these old dump sites. Just double check those, make sure there's not any kind of toxic chemicals or barrels of oil and stuff in them that would go up in the future. Basically, just do a really good, thorough inventory of the whole entire site, because it's I guess if you really wanted to, go back out multiple times and look, but sometimes you don't have the luxury of that, especially if you live a couple hours away trying to plan a burn. So once you complete your initial scouting and initial site visit, basically what you need to do is you need to take all this information that's now on your paper and in your head, and you need to put it into a digestible, organizable, readable document for whoever your audience may be, right? Your audience may be your fire chief. It could be the crew that's coming out to help you burn, all that stuff. So the good news is that this is, something that happens quite a bit. So most states have multiple resources that have been put together as templates for you to use. And like I said, these range from like super basic plans all the way up to like 50 pages with supporting documents. And again, I'll reiterate, if you can do a simple, very basic burn plan that meets your needs and be safe, absolutely do it. Don't overplan. We'll take a look at a couple different examples. Here's an example that I got from Ed Hubbs from Audubon. I don't know if they still use this or not, but they had this one essentially follows the Nebraska state statute almost to the letter. Like they put the very specific quotes in it, and they fill in the information, and it's like 3 pages. Put a map on it, and you're good to go. And it is good, 100% compliant with the burn. Oops. I thought I should have been able to. Maybe not. So, and then here's another very generic burn plan that was put together here in Nebraska, but is also applicable elsewhere. This has all the basic information on it that you need: objectives, places to put your fire break stuff in, and we'll go over some of this stuff a little bit later too. But again, there's also a whole section on here where you can actually just draw a map on it, which is really cool. And by the way, I will post this stuff, post these burn plans for everybody to take a look at, and I'll show you where to go in the future for those. So another really good one that we use here in Nebraska, or that I like using, is this is the 2008 version of the NRCS burn plan that the state NRCS put together. This is a really simple and kind of basic one that kind of hits all the points that we need. And then this is the latest version of the NRCS burn plan. This is the one that our staff is currently using. This is a lot more detailed. There's a lot more information. They ask for more supporting documents, and this is required, by the way, if you have an EQIP contract through the NRCS or a CSP contract or whatever. If you have anything through the NRCS, this would be like a required document. And we'll go over one of these in a little bit. So basically, when filling out these templates, some of the information is obviously very basic, and we're just plugging them in. And it doesn't really require any more like thought or planning. It's just like, okay, what's the name of the landowner? All this stuff. So there's general site information, utilities. That's all pretty self-explanatory. But there are several things within our burn planning that we needed to kind of pay closer attention to, and that probably I get the most questions on. And so we'll kind of go over those. So one of them is the weather parameters. And I get this question all like, what weather parameters should we use? And it's probably like, of all the difficult questions I probably get asked, I think this is probably the most difficult one to answer, because there's so many different factors that could go into it, right? Some of those could be, well, what's your burn level experience? What are the fuels like? What's your objectives? All these things are going to kind of depend. So, if you're just looking for, general guidance, the one thing that I recommend is you want to make sure you put a range of acceptable conditions in order for it to burn safely and meet your objectives. But also don't put yourself in a bind by using really narrow parameters, right? So I could easily write every burn plan from like, okay, I want it to be 65 degrees to 80 degrees and 20% humidity to 30% humidity and 5 to 15 mile an hour wind. I could put that in almost every burn plan because that's typically the weather conditions that we're utilizing when we're burning. But then if I burn outside of those parameters, we'll be technically out of prescription. So if I could go in and burn it when it's 50 degrees out. Theoretically, I'd be out of prescription. Now, if you're going to be out of prescription, I'd rather be out of prescription on the low end than on the high end, right? So putting that high parameters are, you want to put them in there. So we'll talk about that in a little bit about some of the weather stuff. And then also when you're planning your burn, this is really important. So think about your dominant wind directions when you're planning a burn. And this comes up all the time. So like in the springtime here in Nebraska, if you need to plan a burn with northwest wind and you're planning on burning in early April, well, most of our burn days are south wind because it provides that nice warm, dry weather, nice days out. Well, every time a cold front comes through, it gives us northwest wind. So you're not going to be able to get 75-degree northwest wind days. So if you can't meet your objective with that, that could be an issue. So also, maybe a northwest wind in the middle of summer, that would work, right? So when we typically get northwest winds in the summer, it's still warm and dry. It's just not as, the humidity drops. It's not as warm and humid when we get those northwest winds. And then also there's also other wind directions that are like, I'm not saying they don't exist because I had to eat crow this year, but northeast winds almost very rarely happen. So you could plan a northeast wind direction, but I'm telling you, it takes a miracle to get it. And like I said, I had to eat crow this year because I said, man, northeast wind directions are terrible. And then I needed a northeast wind direction on a summer burn we did, and we got it, and it was a great burn. So it's just all about the timing of those things. Not saying that you couldn't burn a northwest wind in the springtime, because certainly it'll happen, but try to plan it with that more dominant wind direction of south and southwest, southeast, west, those general directions. So the other thing about equipment, so a list of equipment that needs to be present to safely on a burn, right? We want to make sure we put that into our document. Now, the big thing here is if it is listed in that burn plan, it needs to be on site. Okay. So one thing I always recommend is always put the minimum amount of fire equipment that you're going to need on site. If more shows up or you ask more to show up, that's great. But you never want to get into a situation where you're putting more equipment down than is actually going to show up, because then you will be out of compliance. And then what happens is if something goes wrong, a burn gets out, a lawyer will come sniffing around and they'll look at this burn plan and say, well, it says here you're supposed to have two 200-gallon pumper units, and you had one 200-gallon pumper unit and one 150-gallon pumper unit. Now, not the biggest thing in the world, but if you're missing those items, it's going to make them question whether you knew what you were doing. And for that, sometimes it's hard to know if you don't know the people or what equipment they have. So you basically need to ask the landowner or the contractor or the prescribed burn association of what equipment they have. So you could write a burn plan for a prescribed burn association, and you say that they have 2 300-gallon pumpers. Well, they only have 200-gallon pumpers. Well, that's a problem. Then you're already out of compliance with your burn plan. So jotting down that equipment and knowing that equipment is really good. And we're lucky here in Nebraska that a lot of our PBAs that we work with have a kind of a basic standard set of equipment that we can use or go off of, which is really nice with our burn trailers. So this is also probably one of the biggest kickers. A PBA is a prescribed burn association. Somebody has a question. So a PBA is a prescribed burn association. What it is essentially is a collection of landowners or land managers that get together and help each other burn. It's basically like a burn cooperative where they all share their resources to accomplish getting fire on the ground. So when we talk about the firing method and ignition plan, there's really two schools of thought, and we'll talk about them today, both of them here in a little bit. But one is a general description of how it should be burned, right? Nothing fancy, just like we're going to be using a ring fire technique in the downwind corner. We're going to light a backing fire. We're going to use some strip firing, and then we're going to ring the unit. That's your firing method and ignition plan. But there's also this other school of thought in which the people that are approving these plans want something more involved. And so this more involved, basically they want like a step-by-step or a play-by-play of how the unit's actually going to be burned. And it's in one way it can be good, and other ways it can be bad, right? If you're burning just a simple 30 or 40 acre square, probably not that big of a deal. But once you get into like more complex terrain, really kind of going through and thinking about the details on how it's actually going to be burned is probably really good. Got another question here. So the burn permit's only allowed for 30 days. And so after that 30-day window is over, you would just have to go back to the fire chief and get another 30-day permit. Okay, crew assignments is another thing that trips up some people. So you don't necessarily need to list out the actual people that are going to show up on your burn, because we typically never know who's showing up on our burn until they show up. So what we'll do is just actually go in and put down who the burn boss is, or the burn boss, crew boss, igniter. So we'll actually just put the job descriptions on what all we need. And then the day of, as people are checking in with equipment and stuff like that, we will actually go in and fill in their names next to their assignments. And then spelling out what areas need special protection. Again, this just goes in. This is more of a list for like the landowner of what they need to accomplish prior to getting the burn done. So, maybe they need to rake around the house or use a weed whacker around the pool. I like to include like a time frame of when that stuff needs to be accomplished by, especially like for wintertime or burning brush piles, or even putting in a mowed fire break. It's not that all special, but making sure that they put their fire break in the fall instead of in the springtime. Smoke management. Consider how long you plan on having smoke in the air. Look at affected parties and contact prior to burning. We, in our burn plans, we typically put that contact information in there. So you can text your neighbors or call the people and say, hey, make sure you don't have laundry out. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens is that in the springtime when we're doing our burning, it's usually like it's been a crappy winter. We got polar vortexes and 30 inches of snow on the ground, and all of a sudden we get one nice day and we're all burning. So people like to have their windows open, air the house out, and if you're blowing smoke right into them, they're not going to be very happy. And then of course, looking at your mop-up plan, like do you need a harrow to break up cow pies? How long does the site need to be monitored? Who's actually going to be doing that monitoring to spell that out? Like my farm here, I got like some oak woodlands, and so basically every time I burn, I've got to like have somebody here for at least like 2 days at a minimum. Usually, it's getting better. Every year we burn, we actually get easier because we're cleaning up all the down logs and snags and all that stuff. And then also another thing that we really like to put in our burn plans is some kind of contingency plan. Like what happens if the fire does get out? Are there areas where we have backup fire breaks? What's the plan to call the fire department? What happens if there is a wind shift? Just simple things like that we can just plug in. And there's areas in these templates where you can just easily just kind of plug in that information on how to do that. All right. So the one thing, I love making maps. I'm a map person. But making maps can be kind of difficult for some people. Like I said, to make a very basic map, you can hand draw. You could draw your own field. Like I said, put your fire breaks on there. All that, wind direction, all that stuff, all good. But a lot of times we kind of need to go above and beyond and have better quality of map, especially for more complex burns. I've seen people use Microsoft Word. They use like insert shapes and on the drawing tab. If you can figure that out, God bless you, because I've tried it and it's impossible. There's some other programs I know people have used in the past that work for them, and if it works for you, that's great. But I use ArcGIS, and ArcGIS it's a professional grade program. But the cool thing is that if you do a lot of burns yourself or want to get into the business of writing burn plans for people, ArcGIS, Esri, they actually offer like $100 a year ArcGIS platform that you can do it, which is really cool. And I'll show you here in a minute. So the one thing that when you make a map, right? So every map that you make needs to have a legend, right? So if you're setting up a staging area, you put like an S or something on it. Like make sure down at the bottom of it you have something that says, this is the staging area. This is what this symbol actually looks like. And again, this is going to contain like some basic information. We can get, and I'll show you a bunch of different examples of maps here coming up, but there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. But the basic information that we want to put on there is the burn unit, right? Required by state statute here in Nebraska. Fire breaks, roads, access, wind direction, and vegetation. Like those are like the main things that we want to put on there. Now we want to put more stuff on there, right? I want to know, you know, where my water sources potentially are. I want to know where the steep parts are, or wet parts are, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to change this here real quick, and I'm going to show you. So this is the ArcGIS program that I use currently to plan all my burns. And I actually put together a template of every symbol and stuff that I typically use on a burn. So over here on the left side, I've got it broken down into different categories. So I got hazards, access and safety. I've got ignition, fire breaks, and then drop points. And this program is really simple to use. It takes a little bit getting used to, and we're actually planning on doing a program on this. And if you know any staff or anybody would like this, I'd be more than happy to email it to you too. But it's really easy. I mean, if you want to put in, you know, let's say we're putting in a 2-track road. We got all this stuff in the way here. You know, I can draw 2-track roads. If I want to put in, you know, gates, access points, I can drop in access points really easily. If there's ponds, you know, let's say there's a pond here. Draw ponds. If I want to put in my wind directions, so this is a very simple way to draw on my burn plans. And like I said, I've got all the stuff, all the symbols are already there. You know, if you want to put in your fire breaks, you know, disc fire breaks, all that stuff in there. Somebody's saying that there is some open source GIS products out there, QGIS. Yeah, I've heard about them. I've never used them, so I don't know how they work. But I know for at least for some of our Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever staff, if anybody's interested, I'd be more than happy to send you this stuff too. So. All right, so the one thing about making maps is, especially if you got this GIS stuff, it's very easily to get very crowded. So a lot of times we make multiple maps, and I've basically broken down the maps that we put on into like a fire break and hazards map, ignition plan map, 2-mile buffer, and then a contingency plan map. And I would say when you're putting stuff on a map, whether you're hand drawing it or doing a GIS or whatever, try to only add things that aren't going to change, that are like static. If you can add tender, like water tender locations and stuff on the map. But you know, if you get into, you know, the day of the burn while you're doing the crew briefing, you know, you may have to just mark on there, you know, this tender is now here, so you can just cross it off. So you can put those locations on there just as a reference point, especially if you're giving it to a landowner. So here's a couple different maps, and this is like kind of a really basic plan. We got our roads on here. We've got houses identified. We got fire break locations. So we got natural fire break. These are roads here. Mode fire break here. There's a dozer fire break here. We got wind directions from the northwest and west. We've also got the vegetation. Oh, can everybody hear me? Oh, perfect. Sounds like somebody lost sound there for a minute. So around here, I like to put, so, you know, according to our state statute, and it's good practice just to put what the surrounding vegetation is. So like a dormant grazed pasture. So we know that that's a grazed pasture and it's typically going to be dormant during the season. soybean stubble, ungrazed woody draws, just kind of broadly define the vegetation surrounding the immediate area, right? Most of the times people can look at this and say, oh, you can immediately recognize what some of this stuff is if you look at maps enough. So this would be like a fire break and hazard map of what we put on there. This turned out to be a pretty good easy burn that we didn't need much on there. And then this is what we call an ignition map. And this ignition map is essentially how we're planning to do this burn. So you can see that we're planning this with a west or northwest wind. And we actually got our starting point, ignition point down here. And then you can see that crew 1 is going to be going to the west and crew 2 is going to be going to the north. And we also have some stopping points on there. So this is like in reference. So basically, the burn boss would be like, okay, get to point B and stop, get to point F and stop. And then you kind of sit there and hold, and we want to get kind of a back burn in there. And then once that happened, then this crew here, crew 1, would continue north once they got the go ahead from the burn boss. So I like to have both this map and the ignition map. When we do our crew briefing, I like to print them back to back if you can. It only works on some printers. Otherwise, you might have to staple them. That way, both, they can look at the hazards and stuff surrounding it, whatever it may be. And then also the ignition map on how, because some ignitions get more complex than this. And this is kind of a 2-mile buffer. And this actually came from NRCS, where they require this kind of 2-mile buffer map. But it's actually pretty good. It helps you plan for smoke management. All these houses here, different roads and stuff like that. So it kind of gives you a broad overview. If the fire is heading to the south, you can see that it's going to run into more cropland versus if it runs anywhere else, it's going to run into more range ground. And by all means, if you're a landowner looking to put together your own, you don't need this 2-mile buffer map. Not necessary, for, especially if you're burning just, your CRP or something like that. So in this map is actually a contingency map, where it essentially has these lines here. These are roads, so these are like fallback points. So if that fire did get out, there's potential that the crew could come burn off this stuff and fight fire from these locations with relative effectiveness, do a back burn. And we've got some other examples of that. So here's another map that looks kind of complex. This was one that was being written here. I think David's on the conference with us here, but you can see this was kind of the original outline that they did. They put in like all the different fence locations on here, different safety zones, stock tanks, staging areas, different trails that they could use because there were going to be lots of interior igniting on there. Tinder locations, which is fine. Different areas, there's wet areas, different access points. So, this is kind of like the initial map that they kind of put together, but then it kind of got changed right after site visits and consultations. Things change. And this is kind of how the map ended up kind of going toward. They actually expanded the burn unit to make it easier and larger to burn. Here was the original line here. You can see that they just moved this burn out into this pasture and basically simplified this burn here pretty easily. And then they also went around this grove of trees instead of having to go through here, which would have basically required some machinery to kind of go out and around it. But you see, they got a nice legend on there. It's got ignition point. It's got ignition directions on it. They've also labeled like areas that have big chunks of cedar trees in there, just for people's future reference. Here's another fire break and hazard map on a field. You can see they've got different places. There's staging, safety area, where the water truck's going to be, what kind of fire breaks they're going to be put in. They're going to put in disc fire breaks around here. They've got access points. You know, you got a pond out in the middle there. They've even got like these grove of trees here. They labeled it hardwoods, you know, because it would make a difference, you know, if you're burning and maybe there's a group of cedar trees, you know, that could affect the burn plan. And then here's an ignition plan. And one important thing about the ignition plan too is, you know, going back to these drop points. You know, we typically put these drop points in areas that are really easily recognizable. And you know, if they're not in a place where they're easily recognizable, you can put out. You can buy those like just little miniature traffic cones and write like A, B, C, D on them, and put them in the burn trailer, and that way, you know, you can basically post those. But a lot of times they're pretty easy to find where we're actually putting those. We're just going to go through some maps here, but here's another map. You know, again, we got our vegetation around. We got our fire breaks put in there. Where's our safety zone? Where's our water tender? Where's our staging area? And then again, here's an ignition map. Here's another ignition map. Again, you know, like I said, sometimes these maps can kind of get a lot of stuff happening on them. So one of the tricks about map making, obviously, is trying to figure out how everything kind of fits together and looks together. You know, taking out some unnecessary stuff. This particular, we have one or couple that actually want all these fences labeled in here, and it tends to kind of muck up and make things kind of crowded on maps sometimes. But they're good to have. Here's another really basic one. It's got the wind direction, county roads. Here's our ignition sequence, our fire breaks. Really simple and to the point of what you need. You know, if you were using this as just a one-page map, all you need on here would be your conditions or your vegetation and conditions, and you'd be good to go. Here's my northeast burn unit that I was talking about. This was the summer burn that we did. Perfect northeast wind day. Simple burn plan. This is all fully compliant with state statute and would be the kind of the basic what you would need to do an actual burn. Again, another one, you got the roads labeled, ignition sequences, you got maps or your fire breaks all labeled in there. And in this case, this area was already burned, so they got it marked already burned area. A couple different other styles. Again, you know, with this stuff, you know, there's a lot going on, but, you know, again, it's still, it all, you know, it's got the same information on there. Just making sure that you're able to interpret it and utilize it. You know, as long as you got this key, this legend over here, this one's a little bit more detailed. They actually broke this into like, you know, for the landowner, like a shredded fire break, 30 foot, and they actually put where that shredded fire break would go, or a disc fire break, all in there. Again, here's another one where it's kind of just got the basic information in there. This is another summer burn that we had planned, but didn't happen. You know, these were oak woodlands that wouldn't burn during the middle of summer. And then this was kind of our ignition pattern. We were going to burn this little chunk here and this. I think we only ended up burning this. This is one of our growing season burn workshops. So basically we can hand this out to, you know, the people that are the crew that are running it. We basically hand them this and say, okay, here's where your crew is going to be traveling. Here's where your crew is going to be traveling. And, you know, here's your drop points to follow. And so the burn boss and crew bosses can all keep tabs of where everybody's at as they're doing it. And I think this is the last one again. All the information that we need on here, real simple, easy to put on. Another ignition pattern. So again, making maps, to me, it's real fun. I love making all the maps. And again, it's really easy to, if you're just going to do a basic plan and you want to put in that information and hand draw it, do that. If you have a more complex burn, I would suggest reaching out to one of our farm biologists and RCS staff to help you kind of draw, a bigger map that has more stuff on it, because it can be kind of tedious hand drawing all that stuff too. So, all right. So once we've kind of gone through all that, writing down our plan, we want to make sure we review that plan. So once you completed a draft, get it reviewed, send it to others for review, because obviously if you're so laser focused on a project, sometimes you miss kind of the easiest thing. And then you want to make sure your plan is still valid by confirming with another site visit. So after you get it finished, do another run around the unit, look at if anything changed, whether the plan still makes sense after you get on the ground. So basically you're ground truthing it. And one thing I will say is that I've never met a burn plan or never seen a burn plan that I couldn't criticize, right? Or change. The one thing that I would say is that make sure that the consideration is to determine if that it's a personal preference or it's critical to safely burning, right? If it's just a personal preference that you like it this way versus that way, that's one thing. But if it's very critical to the safe burning of a site, that's another. Good constructive criticism essentially is basically what those plans need. And then of course modify a plan if needed. Like I don't know how many times. I mean, there's some burns that you go through maybe 3-4 drafts on to get it finished. And then there's other burns where you can probably get it done with just one try. And I'll show you that. So depending on your circumstances, who you work for, you may need to have someone sign off on that burn plan for you. In Nebraska, a fire chief is at the least the minimum person that's going to be required to look at it and approve it. But NRCS has their own approval system. Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever have an approval system. The state feds all have kind of their approval system as well. But if you're just a local landowner, the only person that needs to review that burn plan is the fire chief. All right, so we'll just quickly go over this burn plan here. This is, if I were burning off a 20 acres or 30 acre CRP, pretty square, pretty straightforward. This is the type of burn plan that I would put together. Again, easy details to put in there up top here. What's your objective of your burn? This one's just maintaining grassland diversity and productivity, reducing litter and controlling woody vegetation. Pretty simple. Fill in this information. Who's going to be the burn boss? Here they want to know the types and dimensions of fire breaks. So you basically just type in what fire breaks you're going to have, where they're going to be located. In this case, it's just going to be a mowed fire break around the entire unit, 30-foot width. Pretty easy, straightforward. So when I talked about earlier about the firing method, about there's 2 schools of thought. So this is like the basic language that you could pretty much copy and paste on almost every basic burn plan CRP. And I'll just read this quickly to you. This burn will employ the ring fire technique, beginning in a downwind corner, light a backing fire off a wet line and let it back burn about 5 foot. Then proceed to ignite strip head fires, increasing the size of the downwind black. Then 2 separate crews will proceed along the flanks using wet lines, maintaining the appropriate distribution based on the configuration of the unit as to not trap interior igniters that will continually be using strip head fire method to increase downwind black. Once a fire has burned sufficient vegetation as to prevent a head fire from throwing embers across the fire line, interior igniter can cease operations and the flanking crews can proceed around the flanks. And then once secure, both teams can converge on the upwind point, creating head fire and finishing the ring fire's ignition. And then burn boss will ultimately dictate how this unit is burned and has the authority to change it based on the weather and site conditions. So that is, vague enough, but accomplishes our objective of telling them how we're going to burn this thing, right? And this may be completely different if you're using it for, a different ecosystem. You may want to, however you burn, you're just basically kind of just leave it vague language of basically broadly how you're going to burn this thing. If you're going to backfire the whole thing, just tell them you're going to backfire the whole thing. Pretty easy. And then in here, there's a place for contingency. Again, a lot of times this information can be just kind of copy and pasted, unless there's like very specific information that you need to put in there, that needs to be in there. But burn boss will either hold or extinguish planned fire, dispatch crews to extinguish flames. You can read it, but essentially it's just what are we going to do? But if you have a more complex burn, there may be very specific contingency plans that need to be put in place. Same thing as wind or wind shift. And then under smoke management here, typically we're burning in good to fair, and then you just want to estimate the time of ignition from burn, and that just gives like, my fire chief is like, let's say I tell them it takes 3 hours to burn this thing, and there's smoke 6 hours after I start them. I tell them I'm starting it. Well, that could raise, a few eyebrows and say, wow, why they're still burning. And so one of the things I recommend is always like figure out how many hours you think it's going to take to burn, and then double it, because that's basically what usually ends up happening anyway. Then here's our equipment list. This is basically just pretty easy. They have like the most basic things that we put in here, like how many bumper trucks, how many drip torches, what's your kestrel, how many radios do you need? All that information you can just plug it in here, right? Here's what's needed. Then once you acquire it, you can put you acquired it and whatever date it is. Again, this is the minimum, right? So if you have 4 pumper trucks that show up, that's great. But if you only have 1 pumper truck that show up, that's bad. And then here's the pre-burn protection. Again, here's an area. Okay, got any pens and barns? Well, what do I need to do? Put in there, need to weed eat around. Oil, gas structures, weed eat around, or whatever it is. Just you put it in there, define it, and then make sure it gets done. Then, of course, here's our crew and responsibility. So again, I got, typically we have 2 crews because we run employee ring fire technique. So we have a burn boss, and then we've got a driver, pumper, igniter, ATV, missing a V on there. And then, so basically, the way we typically run it is that our crew boss is typically an igniter on each side. So our igniters are technically crew bosses most of the time. Sometimes we put them on ATVs, but I prefer them to be lead igniters. And then projected dates of the burn. On this, every one of them, January 1st to December 31st. I don't like to pigeonhole myself and say I'm going to burn next week, so I'm going to put March 1st to March 7th, because realistically that's probably not going to happen. So I just I'm going to burn it sometime this year. Now, if there's a very specific reason why you can't burn it, any time of the year or whatever, then maybe you need to list those. And then your time of day. So most fire chiefs around here don't like night burning. So they typically want the fire on the ground and started prior to like 5 o'clock usually. But we're burning during the middle of the afternoon or during the day anyway. Then going back to our weather conditions, this is where you put that. Here's our prescribed burn. You can ignore this is for fire break stuff, but 5 to 20 miles an hour. A lot of times we'll put 5 to 15 with gusts to 20, depending on that. What wind directions we can burn with. So this one we can essentially burn with any wind direction we want, but these are the kind of primary ones that we're using. What's our relative humidity? 20 to 60. That pretty much covers us. Air temperature 50 to 90 degrees. Again, you always want to be more careful about your high end than your low end. If you're burning when it's 40 degrees out, your fire behavior is going to be such that it's not going to be as much as if you're burning at 95 or 100 degrees, 10 degrees over your high. And then, of course, we talk about moisture. Ground moisture also can affect your fire behavior, so there's spots for that in here too. and then also how much fuels are out there. Again, this is not needed necessarily per se for a compliant Nebraska burn plan, but it's in here, and I don't like leaving stuff blank, and you shouldn't. Landowners, just landowner names and their phone numbers. What's a fire department? 911. The thing with your volunteer fire department is if you ever put the station number on there, as a volunteer firefighter, there's nobody ever at the fire station unless we have a fire call. So we usually call 911. Same thing with the sheriff's office. And then all this stuff, it's really basic and simple. And then we basically have this simple map. And this is the basic stuff that I put on there. I put access points, water source, where a tender is going to be. I identify any kind of houses in the area, what our fire break is going to be, our burn unit, wind direction, and then our vegetation surrounding it. And that's quite literally what the most basic burn plan that you could put together would be. And then here is just another kind of a larger map that I put together, close to town. So depending on, especially if you have people coming from across the area to help you burn, this is kind of like a locator map. And this locator map tells people how to get to the site. So I could just say, well, come down County Road 46 and come to the house here, and we're going to be staging up there in this area. All right, so we move from like a very kind of a really basic burn plan into maybe like a little more complex. And it's not necessarily that it's more complex. There's just more information that you basically put on the thing, and more things happening. So again, the same basic information when we're talking about, who the owner and address and telephone numbers, all that stuff. And what's cool about these templates is like they already have like our basic objectives of our burn. We can just click on whatever one we want, right? Eastern red cedar. Well, that's an objective of every burn, at least of mine. Improve wildlife habitat or grazing distribution. All these different things you can check on there. And then in this section, this is like a description of the burn unit. So they have all these different things in here that you can put in here, like what kind of woody species are present, what kind of herbaceous species are present. So you got a question: do you have emergency medical on your burn plans, either on site or off site? Yeah, we basically just have 911 in there. We don't have emergency medical on site when we actually do our burns. If there was an emergency, we would just call 911 and have them dispatch the volunteer fire department. So this is basically simple information, and this all goes back to predicting fire behavior, really, right? So what our fuel load is, like, okay, yeah, we have fine fuels at 3,000 pounds per acre, and it's 4 foot tall, right? So if you're looking at this burn plan will basically tell me that this could be a very volatile fire, right? 3,000 pounds of acre of grass, 4 foot high. That's a fairly decent amount of fuel out there. And then they also got planned, so it looks like it's going to be about the same. Then soil moisture conditions. I like burning that. Drier the better for me. And then they got existing conditions, so they want you to kind of describe what type of vegetation condition on the land adjacent to the burn on all sides, and so indicate what direction it's from. So here it'd be just like on all sides, surrounding landscape is generally the same, and you just put that on there. Burning history, what's basically happened, has it been grazed, rested, CRP, anything like that. Are there any pre-burn practices that you would put on there? Grazing deferment, brush management, things of that nature. Then also any post-burn conservation practices. Do you have to follow up with a certain number of grazing or anything like that? And then what's your desired condition? So in this point would be like, we want 70% of the unit black, kill 90% of our cedar trees, 40% of our woodland tree seedlings are top killed. That's the desire. So you can use that for monitoring purposes in the future. So you can look back, you know, a couple months later and say, well, did we accomplish that objective? You can write in that burn plan, you know, when you're documenting your weather history, go back and, well, we had these conditions, you know, and if you document every hour or half hour, what's cool is you could actually go back and say, okay, well, you know, we were probably at this point in the day when we were burning this area, and we got this similar, we got the conditions desired effect. So you could actually go back, you know, in the future and say, okay, well, if we want this desired effect in the future, then we need to be in this kind of window of weather conditions, hotter and drier. Any additional conservation practices afterwards, any monitoring methods, again, this is basic stuff. Description of planned fire breaks, again, just, you know, put the location and what kind of fire breaks that are going to be in there. Any additional comments? In this case, bare dirt fire breaks are going to be created using skid steer or just blown off with a leaf blower prior to the burn. And then here's like the same thing on the other is the pre-burn protection areas. Again, leaves and debris need to be raked away from the llama barn and yard around the house. By the way, there are no llamas, they're just a llama barn. Wood fences by the road need to be weed eated around. Turn off the aerators or burn around the aerators around the ponds. So whatever that, you know, same thing. And then on this, they wanted people to describe potential hazards within the burn area, but we essentially just show it on the map. And so I always put like, okay, see map in the crew briefing, because we're going to talk about that stuff. Now, if you had like something very specific, hazardous in your area and needed to describe like how to get around it, like let's say like in the northeast corner, there's, you know, a tricky site and you needed to tell people how to navigate it. One, you could write it in here, but probably nobody's really going to look at it. You know, we'd probably do that prior to the burn. We'd take whoever is going to be doing the crew bossing on that side and take them there. So, and then the same thing with this, the access points, we basically put all that stuff on the map. So here it is. So again, I got our road, we got road signs where we're going to have road crews, roadside signs posted. We got our vegetation types. We've got areas where we're going to put spotters for spotting, you know, different areas here to watch for any kind of embers flying across. We've got access points. We got different fire breaks and the types here. We got all these trails and roads throughout this area that people can use. Wind direction, all that stuff. Now, I guess it's not on this slide, but again, same thing, residences, adjoining landowners, what kind of highways, kind of this basic information that easy, it's like plug and play, right? Doesn't need much explanation. Same thing here, same information as last. Here's the plan date, range of burn, any fuel conditions that like green up would change fire behavior. Leaf drop, obviously, we're burning in woodlands, any kind of brome or anything like that. They also have any other plant or animal like Migratory Bird Treaty Act or T&E species in there. And then they get into the wind. So for those of you in Nebraska that are burning within or planning burns, here they give you like a range of acceptable conditions, and they also have these minimum or maximum values on here. So here's wind direction, northwest, southwest. Here they basically, you have to burn with less than 20 mile an hour wind. You can't plan anything over 20 mile an hour without a variance. You can't plan anything for under 25% humidity without a variance. And you can't plan anything over 80 degrees without a variance. Now, the biggest concern there is this 25%. So normally this 25% number is 20. So this was a non-NRCS burn that we did. So this was obviously at 20, and actually I wanted it probably more like 15 to get my desired burn effects. But we keep it right there. So in Nebraska, for you Nebraska folks, NRCS, our staff, you would have to have variances for that. Now, it also, if you're doing summer burns like this, like we don't even burn if it's below 80 degrees on a summer burn. Like I want it at least 95, 100 degrees outside, ideally, unless we got a lot of vegetation to work with. So here's the main difference between the two. So this is the way our staff is supposed to be doing these burns now. So they actually want a step-by-step kind of playbook of how this thing's going to be burned. So I'm not going to read this whole thing, but essentially parts of it's like, okay, once crew one reaches point B, they will need to switch to laying down wet line in the remainder of the grassland. Crew one will then proceed to point D and hold. As crew one is putting in the backing fire from point A to D, interior igniters will be constantly stripping interior to increase downwind black line. So you can see, like, once crew one reaches point D, burn boss, I mean, it literally will take you point by point on how to burn this thing. Now, I put in a little discretion here at the top where I put in, like, this is just a simplified guide on how to burn this unit. It's based off an idealized west wind direction and should not be considered a literal step-by-step play. And that the burn boss has the full discretion on how it actually gets burned, according to wind direction, personnel, and local conditions. Now, the reason why I somewhat like using this is because it does really force you to think about how it gets burned. And when you are forced to think about how it like literally gets burned, it can force you to make better decisions on how to plan that burn, right? So if you're going through all this mess and trying to read it and trying to figure out, okay, where's point A and B and D and who's crew one and crew two, it's really forcing the planner to really think about, is this burn plan the best it can be? Can I make it easier to make this burn easier to do it? So here would be the map, right? So we have all these, we got the ignition point with the west wind here up in this northeast corner. We got the drop points going all along this thing, A, B, C, D. All these are, A is our ignition point, B, there's a gate there, C, there's a gate there, D, there's a gate there, corner field, stuff like that. So this is kind of like a broad scale. Now, when you get in around this house and this barn here, like this is pretty hard to see. So I actually went in and created a separate ignition plan around it. So the crew that was burning out around, there's actually 3 crews total on this burn, but 2 crews here, they could actually plan with each other to get this thing burned out and around the house and the barn. And then, of course, going back to the escape, this one had a kind of a very specific escape responses. This one had, like, terrain can be very steep. Anyone traveling off designated trails or fire breaks needs to be cautious of tree stumps. That's because the site was logged and trees were cut. And so, when you have a logging operation, sometimes they have tree stumps. So if you have an escape and all of a sudden somebody tears off after an escape and then they rip out their transmission or their front differential. So those are things that are part of a specific escape response. And also the burn boss on this is on the volunteer fire department. So they will basically act as, the incident commander before a fire chief shows up. And also this one here, Morse Bluff, which should be called as soon as possible to aid in suppression. And that's just because in this area, response times from volunteer fire departments, just because of the ruralness of the area, and the terrain of the area, it's best to get that mutual aid started sooner rather than later. So here's a contingency map. So here's the burn unit here, and we were burning with a west-southwest wind direction. Now, most of this stuff is oak woodlands that have been had the cedar trees harvested out of a lot of them. But there's still some, like this whole pocket right here is solid cedar trees. There's a bunch of cedar trees. This is an oak savanna clearing that we did over here. And these are all pastures. So there's a contingency line that has already been built in. And this contingency line, funny enough, was put here on purpose because if it did ever escape, there's no way that we could get fire trucks in here and put out all this woodland stuff. And all these people that own this ground around here want their property burned anyway. So it would be basically just speeding up the process of when we were going to get to burn it. And we could light off, here's a road here, and then this is a ridge line that pops right out to this road that's already got cows on it that are beating down the vegetation. So we could basically just light right off that line with that contingency line, which makes it really easy. And then also here's this kind of broad scale map that I had given to the fire department, identifying access areas not only within our unit, but also access to these other areas of where we're going to be putting in these also houses. So that's more of kind of what a more complex burn would entail. Again, there's a lot of that information that is still standard on a simplified one. It's basically just about plugging in more information and dealing with more complex terrain and issues and actually utilizing that burn or that burn plan. Same vein here. Additional comments regarding smoke in here. A couple things we put in here. Most of my neighbors are very tolerant to smoke. The nighttime inversion can trap smoke in the valley, especially if with the woodlands burning for several days. A lot of times when we burn that unit, we get calls. Well, we used to get calls from people saying that the woodlands are still on fire, even though they're surrounded by black. So we would put in there that there's potential for smoke to be there for several days. Again, that's just another equipment checklist, same as the other. Here's kind of the crew list. This is just set up a little bit different. How many engine operators you need, how many total personnel do you need. One thing, make sure it matches up with your total numbers and total crew. And then this is another kind of a cool part that's on this burn plan is that they have a post-burn evaluation. So, did you have any spotting? Was it difficult to control? Were there fire rules? You can also add other things, looking back on it, like, did you meet your objectives? What was that, 70% vegetation blackened, 40% top kill in the woodlands. Add that stuff in there because you can tuck this away in your files, and then in the future you can go back and look at it to see exactly what it did or what it accomplished, if it accomplished what you needed to. It's a good learning lesson to utilize it. All right, so just to kind of wrap up, and if you got questions coming up here at the end, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or type it in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. So some common mistakes that I typically see here in Nebraska on burn plans. One is that the types and conditions of the vegetative matter to be burned on the land and adjacent areas is typically not on the maps. That is left off, so it's very important. Also, the identification of the roads by name and the houses that may be affected by smoke. Failure to identify equipment they have access to. So the most common thing that I see is that somebody writes a burn plan for two 300-gallon pumper units and they only have two 200-gallon pumper units, or they have 3 ATVs and don't have 4, or something like that, to identify what type of equipment or how many drip torches. Just make sure you know the equipment that's actually going to show up. And then not putting drop points in. I use A, B, C, D, E. I know some people use like the time on the hours on the clock, as reference, like 0100, 0200, 300. That basically correlates to around the map. You can certainly use that. My preference is just the A, B, C, D because what you can do is that if you need to add any drop points to that list, you could just put A1 or B2 or C2 or whatever it may be. The other thing is don't leave any blank spots in your burn plan, in your template, um, because let's say for instance, you get contacted by a lawyer, and that lawyer asks for that burn plan, and they take that burn plan, and they have somebody review it and look it over, and let's say it goes to court or mediation, and you're sitting in that around mediation trying to figure out damages or whatever, and they ask you, why is this blank? And you can answer, well, it wasn't applicable. Well, maybe it was. They could easily kind of pick at it, but if you leave like it's not applicable in there, at least you have like, well, at the time we didn't think it was applicable. But if you just leave it blank, they could say, well, you just glossed over and didn't even think about it, did you? So it's just those little things that make it happen. Also, this is just kind of like a theme, but spelling errors. Just make sure you run your spell check on it to check any kind of spelling errors on it. Again, that's not something that a lawyer is necessarily going to care about in the end things, but it's always good to have proper grammar and spelling in a burn. All right, that's all I had for that. If you have any questions, I got one here. What's the easiest way to distinguish breaks on an aerial? Are you talking about like distinguish like your fire breaks on an aerial photograph? Okay, thanks. So yeah, let's see if I can actually. So, I mean, you can identify in some areas, like, I mean, if you were going to use like this 2-track here, you could identify that from, as a fire break from an aerial photograph, or something like this. I mean, you could tell this is a fence line that obviously had some work done to it. In this case, this was actually a doze line that was put in a number of years ago. Obviously, this could be, breaks in this grassland transition into cropland. You could use this cropland as a fire break, uh, to distinguish that. Now, if you're, putting in, if you're in the future, if you're putting in the, mapping it out, you could obviously go in and put, this is going to be a bare dirt fire break through here, or this is going to be a mode fire break. You could identify that through your mapping, but just from like an aerial photograph, when you're pre-scouting, those are the things that I would look at. If you go back over here to, this, you could tell this is kind of a well-traveled ridge here. I mean, you could use that as a fire break, and that's where that contingency line is right there. Here's actually that northeast burn unit showed up on Google Maps. It's kind of cool. See, another question, is this the new style of NRCS plan available, and is it written with Adobe? I think the one that I just showed you might have been the 2016 version. I think there was actually a newer one, and I believe it was Excel, but you can actually, create in Adobe as well. Another question coming in, what's your experience with using 3 to 4 foot wide streams as a natural fire break? How often fire jump the stream? Typically, 3 to 4 foot wide stream is pretty decent. If you're lighting a backing fire off of it, you of course want to be very cautious of any kind of embers jumping in or whatever. But the one thing I would be concerned about a stream is if there was woody vegetation and it got up in the tree and then started throwing embers across the line. I think that's probably the one thing that I would be most concerned about using a stream or any kind of water feature as a natural fire break. Are there any other questions out there? Let's see. Get a copy of the new plan. Yeah, so we'll post on our nebraskapf.com page. If you go to our fire page, we'll post all the burn plans there that you can use. And then also with the NRCS plan, if you have somebody in the NRCS, they can send it to you. Best time to burn in Nebraska for quick habitat recovery. For my money, that would be summer because almost immediately it starts regrowing. But that's kind of a loaded question because it kind of depends on what objective you're looking or what kind of habitat you're looking at or what species specific that you're looking to burn, right? So obviously, if you're maybe burning for turkeys, burning in late April, early May is not necessarily the best idea just because there's a lot of turkey nests dropping on the ground at that point. Now they'll re-nest, but as far as like return time of vegetation to get going, I've seen like regrowth of a burn or of vegetation like 2 days after a burn on one of our summer burns. But Nathan, that would be like a good question to ask a local biologist to work out with that. David says that on the EFOTG is publicly available. So if you go to EFOTG, just Google that and go to Nebraska and then go to section 4. It should be under 338 prescribed burning. Good questions. I think the biggest thing about burn plans is that it just takes time to plan them and get used to them. Once you figure out a good system for you and how to get burn plans written, they're pretty easy to do. So, like I said, I think the most basic form of burn plan that is required by state statute in Nebraska is pretty simple to do. And of course, if you got questions about burn plans, feel free to contact me. We also have wildlife biologists across this country, Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever. A lot of NRCS staff across different states also have good burn experience on writing burn plans. Also, there's state level resources, the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, your state wildlife agencies. A lot of them can help write burn plans as well. Many times, when I used to have an office in town, a lot of times we'd have people just come in and we'd sit over the counter and write up a quick burn plan. So, for anybody also, if you know anybody that missed this and you'd like to share it, we will post this on our YouTube, Nebraska Pheasants Forever YouTube channel, probably next week. So feel free to pass it along to anybody that missed it. And hopefully everybody got something out of it, learned something. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to teach me some things too. I'm still learning every day. So. If there isn't any other questions, I'll kind of hang around for a little bit. And if not, thanks everybody for showing up and working through the polar vortex last week.